We're now approaching the second Sunday of the Easter season, and the lectionary offers us two main readings we could look at. One of those is from Acts chapter 2. It's the second half of Peter's speech at Pentecost. But I think to focus on that might be a bit odd. We're getting ahead of ourselves and jumping on to Pentecost. We're obviously going to come to that in a few weeks' time. But the other reading is the second half of John chapter 20. We looked at the first half last week with Mary's encounter with Jesus, with Simon and the other disciple coming to the tomb. In this second half, Jesus meets the disciples all together. And of course, it includes the famous episode with so-called doubting Thomas. I live in a house which was built in 1850, and originally it was built as a farmhouse, but it was built on clay. This area is clay. It's next to the Trent River. And if you can dig into one of the beds over here, you can actually dig up lumps of red clay, and it could be quite difficult to grow things in. But over the years, because there were horses and cows kept here, then on top of that clay have been layers laid of fertile mulch. And actually it's not difficult to grow things here at all. There are layers, deep, rich layers that things can grow in. And the same is true of this Bible reading as well. The story of Jesus meeting the disciples and encountering Thomas, as the writer of the Gospels has reflected on this over the years, he writes it in such a way that creates this rich, deep layer which we can grow things in. But of course, as people have read this story as well through the history of Christian interpretation, further layers have been added. Some of those helpful, some of those perhaps less helpful. So what we need to do this Sunday is we need to dig down, look carefully, and together attend to the text. There are several striking contrasts as we move from the first half of John 20 to the second half. The most obvious thing is that it's no longer the early morning. We no longer see that the light is gradually breaking through. It's the evening of still that first day of the week, the beginning of something new, the beginning of this new era, of this new resurrection life. And of course, the first scene happened in the garden outside. So we've had to come into a room because this is where this action takes place. The disciples, well, my version says the disciples were together, but the text doesn't say that really. It simply says the disciples were in a room. We've no idea whether they felt any sense of togetherness. Just because you're confined together, in this case out of fear, it doesn't mean that you have any sense of togetherness. I wonder what sort of conversations they were having, how they were reflecting on the different ways that each of them had reacted to the events of the preceding few days. And of course the great contrast is that in the first half of the narrative, Jesus has broken out of this place of confinement. He's broken out of the tomb. He's come through those bandages, the things that wound him round that symbolize the constraint of death. But here the disciples are in a room with a door that's shut and locked out of fear. My translation here rightly says fear of the Jewish leaders. The word in the text, Judaioi, it does seem to be used in this gospel in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's talking simply about Jewish ethnic identity, the Passover of the Jews. Sometimes it's talking very specifically about Jews who had believed in Jesus and had turned away from him. We see that in chapter 8. Here it seems clear that it's fear of the Jewish leaders, the Judeans, those who, unlike the Galilean pilgrims who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, see him as a threat to power. And given that they've bumped off Jesus, I suspect the disciples, as the inner circle whom Jesus has confided in, whom he's shared his leadership with, they're the ones who are next for the chop. And then something unexpected happens. Jesus came and stood amongst them. However divided they are, however fearful, however at odds with one another, and perhaps still not quite believing the testimony of Mary, who's come and told them that the Lord has risen. Jesus comes and stands among them. It's the same phrase we find in the beginning of the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 1, Jesus stands amongst the lampstands, which represent the congregations, the churches, at the end of the first century that John is writing to. And he says to them, "Peace be with you." Now, in one sense, that's just a standard greeting. That's what you would say if you met someone in the street, "Peace be with you." In Luke's gospel, it has added significance. The gospel, the good news, is good news of peace from beginning to end. Right at the very beginning, when the angels announced to the shepherds that the Son of David is to be born in Bethlehem, it's news of peace, goodwill to all people. And yet in this gospel, this fourth gospel, it has an added significance because, of course, Jesus has just the week before, around what is probably the Last Supper, that Last Supper discourse, he says to them, "In this world you will have trouble, but I give you peace." So this person that they meet is the same person, amazingly, that they were eating with just a few days before. After he says this, he shows them his hands and his, well, in Luke's gospel, it's his hands and his feet. But here, it's his hands and his side. This has a really important symbolic significance within the fourth gospel. You see, Jesus has said that if, in chapter 2, if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days. In other words, he's not talking about the temple buildings around him. He's talking about himself as the new temple, himself as that place of God's holy presence, the place where people will come and worship and will encounter God for themselves. And because of that, in Ezekiel's apocalyptic vision, he sees a renewed temple and he sees the Spirit, the water of the Spirit flowing, this water, life-giving water flowing from the side of the temple. And John seems to pick up that image. In chapter 7, Jesus cries out in a loud voice and says, "Whoever believes me, water, living water, will come from within or from his side." And he's probably referring to himself, that for those who believe, the water of the Spirit will flow out of Jesus himself. And of course, that makes sense of what happens in his death on the cross, when his side is pierced and blood signifying his sacrificial death and water signifying the flowing of the Spirit come from his side. And the writer of the gospel makes a particular point to say the one who testified it saw it and is telling you about it. The disciples, not surprisingly, are overjoyed when they see the Lord. Again, we go on to verse 21. Again, Jesus says, "Peace be with you." This is obviously really important to them, that he comes to give them peace despite the trouble, despite the fear that they fear, despite having the door locked. He comes and brings them his peace. And again, he'll say it a third time for emphasis in the next part of the passage. "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Jesus doesn't come just to comfort them and just to encourage them or to reassure them. And of course he does all those things. He actually comes to commission them for ministry and for mission. Just as Mary has come as the apostle to the apostles to share the good news and to tell them something. She wasn't just encountering Jesus for her own benefit, but to bless others with the message. So Jesus commissions them to do the same thing. The writer actually uses different words for sending. He uses apostello for "as the Father sent me" and pempo for "sending you." But it's worth noting in this gospel that the writer often uses different synonyms to mean the same thing. And that's going to become really important when we get on to read chapter 21 and Jesus' recommissioning of Peter as an individual. And then we get John's brief summary of Pentecost and all that's associated with it. With that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Now, that's obviously a very different account from the one we find in Luke and Acts, and I'm not sure there's a very simple way to reconcile these two chronologies. But John is doing something very important to us in telling us what the Spirit does and who Jesus is. First of all, he agrees with Luke that it is Jesus who dispenses the Spirit. In Luke's account, Jesus says, "I must go to the Father so that we can send the gift of the Spirit on you." And sure enough, after the ascension follows Pentecost and the outpouring of the Spirit. And theologically, this gospel agrees entirely with that. It is Jesus who breathes the Spirit into them. And of course, there are echoes there of the original creation, when God forms the man out of the dust of the earth and he breathes into his nostril and breathes life. So Jesus, the firstborn of the new creation, breathes this life into his disciples and reanimates them as well and equips them for mission. So it tells us something about Jesus, but it also tells us something about the Spirit and about mission. Jesus is sending them, and he cannot send them unless they have the Spirit. As Luke says, the Spirit will come on you, power on high will come on you, and you will be my witnesses. So on the one hand, we can't be witnesses without the Spirit of God. On the other hand, we can't have the Spirit of God without being witnesses. This is what the Spirit does. The Spirit testifies to Jesus. So when we are filled with the Spirit, then we too are equipped to testify. We can't not do it. Or, as Revelation puts it in a different way, the Spirit are the eyes of the Lamb ranging throughout the earth. It's the Spirit's job to seek out where Jesus wants to go and to take us there so that we can testify to him. And lastly, this tells us something about the people of God, about the ecclesia, about ecclesiology. It's in this Spirit-filled, Jesus-following, resurrection community that we find made real the forgiveness of sins. There's always been a bit of a debate and a puzzle about the second half of Jesus saying, if you forgive anyone's sins, they're forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven, which I think seems slightly strange, and there's no real parallel in that elsewhere in the Gospels. In fact, Joanne Brandt in her Paideia commentary argues that that's a misunderstanding. The language of sin isn't actually repeated. It simply says, those you hold will be held. And I think she makes a good argument for saying, this is the place, this resurrection community is the place where we find forgiveness, but it's also where we find the solid grasp of fellowship, one with another. And so that's the rich theological tapestry within which we read the encounter between Jesus and Thomas. He was one of the 12, and he wasn't with the disciples when Jesus came amongst them. So the other disciples say to him, "We've seen the Lord." Well, that's encouraging, isn't it? Because that's what Mary has done to them, and then Jesus has breathed on them, given the Spirit, and told them that that's what they are to do. They are to go and pass on the message. So they're trying out their mission and evangelism skills on the first person that comes along, one of their own number, Thomas. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. Thomas responds not rationally, but emotionally. Do you feel the force and the punch of his words as he repeats, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and my hand into his side." And he's not being polite here. He doesn't just want to touch and see. He wants to thrust. He wants to throw his hand into the wound that was caused by the spear. "Unless I can do this, I will not believe." This isn't doubting Thomas. This is refusing to believe Thomas. And I wonder why. Well, a few years ago, I was really helped and got an insight from this from a group of school children. I was doing an assembly in a primary school, and we were looking at this story, and I wanted to help them inhabit the story and imagine what it must have felt like. So I began by asking, have you got any heroes? And one chap said, "Oh yes, David Beckham." You can tell it was quite a few years ago. And I said to them, "Oh, David Beckham, well, that's funny. Do you know, as I was walking on my way to school, I passed David Beckham in the street and we said hello. You know, if I'd realised that, he mattered to you, I'd have invited him along." And the person looked rather quizzical. And then I asked for a few more names of heroes. And each time I said, "Oh, I met them last week, or I saw them in the shops, and if only I'd known, I could have, introduced you." And they began to get a little bit suspicious. And then I realised what I was doing. And I said to them, "Well, look, if you were Thomas and, the person you longed to see, you missed out on meeting him, how would you feel?" And immediately a hand went up at the back. "I would be really angry." I don't think we're facing doubting Thomas here. I think we're facing angry Thomas. You see, Thomas has been through all the same things the other disciples have been. He's had his hopes raised. He's spent time in close proximity with Jesus. He's listened to his teaching. He's hung on his every word. He's thought Jesus was the one who would deliver Israel. And he, like the others, has faced the bitterness and the disappointment and the grief of seeing Jesus hanging on the cross. And all the others have had their grief and disappointment dispelled. They've now met the Lord. What does Thomas feel? He's missed out. And he's missed out the experience. He's missed out of seeing the one person he needed to see. And on the 8th day, or roughly a week later, so here we're completing that first week of the new creation, just as we had a first week of testimony at the beginning of the gospel. Once more, the disciples were in the same house, in the same room, and the story repeats itself almost word for word. They're in the house again. Thomas was with them. The doors were locked again. Jesus comes again and stands amongst them again as the Lord of his people. And once more he says, "Peace be with you," as he's done before. Now the third time he's greeted them with peace. And then he turns to Thomas. And two remarkable things happen. First of all, Jesus accedes to Thomas's demands. He says to them, look, here are my hands, here is my side. He's perfectly willing to answer Thomas's questions. He's perfectly willing to give Thomas the evidence that he needs. And then the second remarkable thing, Thomas doesn't need it. Thomas doesn't need to do what he said he wanted to do. He simply recognizes who Jesus is, my Lord and my God. There's a wonderful painting of this episode you may know by Caravaggio. And in one sense, Caravaggio's painting is faithful to the text. It shows Jesus submitting to Thomas's demand. It shows him being willing to offer the evidence. He pulls aside his outer garments so that Thomas can see his wound. But actually it's slightly unfaithful to the narrative, and it shows Thomas poking his finger into Jesus' side rather gruesomely. And of course the narrative simply says, it doesn't tell us he does it. He doesn't need to. He recognizes, like Mary has, this is my Lord. But he also recognizes what the whole gospel has been telling us from the beginning. Right at the start we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so the narrative of the gospel has come full circle now on the lips of Thomas, my Lord and my God. Jesus doesn't rebuke Thomas for his doubt. He doesn't actually say, as many English translations have it, stop your doubting and believe. What he actually says is, stop your unbelief and believe. Stop your refusal because of your anger, because of your feeling left out, because of whatever reason. Lay that aside and put your trust in me. And then he addresses both Thomas and us. He says to Thomas, because you have seen me, you believed. And then it's as if he does this thing in cinema called breaking the fourth wall. He actually turns from Thomas and he turns to us in the words of the writer of the gospel and saying, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, who have, on the basis of this apostolic testimony, on the basis of their own evidence and the basis of their own experience, have put their trust in me. You see, there's no hierarchy of discipleship. There's no distinction between those who met Jesus in the flesh in his resurrected life before the ascension and the others. We're all the same. We're all part of this spirit-filled resurrection, Jesus-following community. We've all been met with by Jesus, and we've all been commissioned as well. As the Father sent me, so I send you, Thomas, you, the 12, you, Mary, and you, those who read this story and put their trust in me. You go and share the good news as well.